finally into the 20s. And the Roaring Twenties was the time period after World War I where there's going to be all of this money and fun and excitement because the war is over. The war industry had really amped up American production, so everybody was just kind of rolling in the money. But it's going to end with the Depression, and we're going to talk over the next couple of nights about how all of this led into the Depression and what the big issues during the 1920s were. So the guiding question that I want you to keep in mind is, how did the Roaring Twenties impact United States history? So in this particular presentation, we're going to look at some of the terminologies with the 1920s. We're going to look at Prohibition, and we're going to look at how people were able to live these really fancy lifestyles that they were living. So some key terms that I want you to keep in mind having to do with the Roaring Twenties. Economic boom, and that's a time of quick economic growth. And we saw that during the 20s, especially the early to mid-20s, because of what I was just talking about, that big amp up of the war industry. Planes and tanks and weaponry and the textiles needed for people's uniforms. So all of those industries really increased during this time period. But it's going to follow with a period of economic bust. And that's a time of quick economic decline. And you have actually seen this in your lifetime with the crash of 2007. So this is something that you're familiar with. So you're aware of how easy it is for the economy to slip. And we're going to talk some about the issues that led to that economic bust after having this economic boom. So like I was just saying, the stock market boomed in the 1920s. Life was good for Americans during this period of economic boom. One of the issues that's going to lead into the bust, and something that even contributed to our most recent economic crisis, is this idea of installment buying and credit. And this is when the payer makes, you can buy an item and you make small payments over a period of time until that product has been paid off. So it works well in buying big ticket items like cars and homes, but people in the 1920s are going to start to use this system of credit for other things as well. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, things like that, other kind of smaller consumer goods. So credit is going to become more widely used during this time period. And you remember talking, we talked about banking earlier on in this year and how it's good to have some credit, but and some debt, but it's not good to have an overwhelming amount of debt. And so what's going to happen during the 20s is people are going to be living these really extravagant lifestyles, and that's going to lead to some credit problems down the road. So changing ways of lives. Urbanization is going to continue to accelerate. And we talked about with the Industrial Revolution, that more and more people are going to move to the big cities because the big cities had a lot of amenities. So for the first time, more Americans lived in cities than in those rural areas. New York City had almost or over 5 million people in 1920, and Chicago had nearly 3 million. So those centers for factories and jobs were really big. And there was this dynamic between people who lived in smaller rural areas and larger urban areas. People considered urban life as anonymous crowds, which means, strangers. You don't know everybody that you're walking down the street to see. Lots of money makers and people who wanted to go out and have a good time. And then rural life was considered safe, close friends, family, all right there together, hard work and morals. And you see some of that today in between the differences with people who live in those rural areas and then people who live in the big cities. So Prohibition, and that's a term that I used when I was introducing this slideshow. So one of the big examples of that clash between the urban and the rural was the 18th Amendment in 1920. So the 18th Amendment led us to a time period that was called Prohibition. So Prohibition essentially said that alcohol was illegal. So not only could you not drink it, but you couldn't make it, you couldn't sell it, you couldn't transport it. So there were a lot of people who really supported that idea of prohibition. They believed that alcohol really led to a lot of crimes, that it led to the abuse of children and women and people not going to work. So they wanted to deal with that, and prohibition was the best way to do that. Most of the supporters of prohibition were from the rural South and the West, which is what we just talked about, those smaller family-centered areas. So prohibition had several side effects. The first side effect is over here, the speakeasies and the bootleggers. A lot of Americans didn't necessarily believe that alcohol was a sin. They didn't believe that drinking it was a problem. A lot of the immigrant groups, especially those who were working these long, hard days and wanted a way to escape, especially were against that idea of banning alcohol. So there were places that you could obtain alcohol illegally or get that alcohol illegally. They went to these underground hidden saloons known as speakeasies. And we're going to talk about that in class a little bit tomorrow. People also bought liquor from bootleggers. And those are people who smuggled liquor in from Canada, Cuba, and the West Indies. And you still hear about bootleggers in the mountains today who are making their own moonshine and whatever else. All of this alcohol issue is going to lead to organized crime. And it's very similar to some of the organized crime that you see today that's centered on drugs. During the 1920s, it was alcohol that it was centered on. So one of the big bootleggers in American history and one of the most famous notorious gangsters is Al Capone. And he essentially took complete control of the Chicago liquor business. And the way that he did that was that he killed off his competition. So he was providing liquor for those 3 million people that I earlier mentioned living in Chicago, and he made a very strict industry out of it. So one of the big issues with prohibition was that the government really did not anticipate how much money was going to be needed to enforce the prohibition laws. You know, just like any new law coming into effect, your big thing is how are you going to police it? How are you going to make sure that people are following the rules? So the task of enforcing it fell to 1,500 poorly paid federal agents. Not an easy task at all. So by the mid-20s, only 19% of Americans are going to support prohibition because they're going to see that organized crime increasing. They're going to see speakeasies and bootleggers, you know, rampant, and they're just going to begin to question the purpose of this law. Many felt that prohibition caused more problems than it actually helped. So the 21st Amendment is going to end up repealing prohibition in 1933. So prohibition was one of the big aspects of the 1920s. So make sure that you have these notes written down so that you can take part in our activity in class tomorrow, and I will see you then. Have a good night.